Welcome, welcome, welcome to Week Old Beans episode 28. I am your host, Ardot, and I have with me, introduce yourself.
I am Fowler. I am the other handsomer co-host.
What you just heard there, ladies and gentlemen, is the sound of a liar speaking. I'm looking at the the video playback right now, and I can see myself in C. Fowler, and I assure you, of the two co-hosts here, I am the more attractive one by a wide margin. So
Listen, we get 500 views, we'll do a face reveal, and I'll reveal it all.
That's a fucking lie. That's a fucking lie. But no, this is Week Old Beans episode 28. We're going to talk about something a little bit different today. It's history. It involves history. One of my favorite topics, as Fowler will tell you. And I think it's important to talk about because I think there's a lot of, in the age of overwhelming news information, there are a lot of things that I think looking back at history can help us sort of understand a little bit better. And one of those things is just, what the sort of original developers of this country envisioned America to be. I'm doing my colonial America Revolutionary War era deep dive, and I found a lot of really interesting things about to start off, this idea that there was this uniform agreement as to what America should be is fiction. Polarization, I guess, has been baked into the fabric of the United States since its inception. So, I think, polarization is simply just a neutral force. It's one of those, things that I think is always happening all the time, anywhere, everywhere, all at once. Haha, you see what I did there. I see you trying to smile, Fowler. Don't tell me you thought that was good.
It was good. Definitely one of the smarter things you've said on this podcast.
True. I think it is the smartest thing I've said on this podcast. So I guess we just are going to talk about that. I mean, we don't really have a through line that we're trying to get to here. We're going to just see how the conversation develops and see where it can take us. But Fowler, do you want to chime in and kind of kick us off? Speak louder.
We should
speak a little bit louder.
A little bit louder? Okay, I'll get closer to the mic.
Yeah, yes, do that, please.
So we view America as the great imperialist empire, the last great superpower, as this idea of like an expanding, like real hegemony. But the reality is that actually a lot of the founders of America did not believe in that at all. They were pretty anti-empire, and a lot of foreign policy in early America was designed to make us isolationist and designed to sort of ensure we wouldn't replicate the British Empire, because the British Empire was the great bugaboo of a lot of the founders, with the exception of maybe Hamilton. But I don't know, Arda, why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
The fuck? No, you just hand this off to me. God, yeah, it's. I think we should start.
What's the point of your autism if it doesn't allow you to, lead in?
The point of my autism is that there's a lot of it happening, and there's a lot of it going on. So it's very hard for me to. So it's very hard for me to sometimes parse through the pages of information that I've read over the course of, my little hyperfixations that I have on certain topics. But, no, like, I think we should start by talking about Hamilton. I think he is probably of all the figures that, constitute this little Backstreet Boys, as I like to call them. I think that he's probably the most interesting and, has become probably one of the most well-known, thanks in no part to one Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote, the music for Encanto, a film that I've watched probably a dozen times at my job over the past, 2 months. Not against my will, but, We Don't Talk About Bruno is a banger of a song.
Well, Hamilton is interesting because a lot of the early founding fathers, they didn't view themselves as Americans. They viewed themselves as whatever state they're coming from. And Hamilton is kind of, he's one of the first and only founders to basically perceive himself as American over his state ideology. Just probably because he came from the Caribbean, right? So he wasn't really, he didn't have that same state allegiance that the other founders had.
Yeah, yeah, and he had some. Why don't you retell the story better than I can? Because I haven't. I learned this from you, and I've not read more into it since you told me. Why don't you tell people about Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and his plans for George Washington after the Revolutionary War as it pertained to how the American government should be organized and how the office of the presidency should be conducted. I think that's a well known, or no, it's a very little known historical fact that I think really, I mean, for me, it changed my perspective on a lot of stuff. But why don't you tell people, lay people out like what that was?
So the Continental Congress was not particularly popular at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. They were perceived as kind of incompetent, not giving enough money to the army, and sort of infighty and weak. And so there were certain figures within the founding fathers, Hamilton being one of the chief ones, who essentially wanted to make America way more centralized. Hamilton didn't necessarily have a problem with there being a dictator. He wanted the presidency to be for life and to basically be a king. And he wanted George Washington to basically be that king for life. And Washington essentially turned down that idea. And I believe Hamilton was also like one of the people who wanted perhaps to crack down on the Continental Congress and basically assume like more power and centralized power. Hamilton is in many ways he's the only modern American among the revolutionary founders because he was for America becoming an empire. He was for America getting stronger and becoming like a superpower. And he also wanted while a lot of the founders were afraid of making the government too powerful and were way more concerned with limiting the government in order to ensure freedom for people, uh, Hamilton was one of the ones who basically did not want that to be the case. He wanted centralized banks, he wanted one currency, he wanted the debt of the federal government to give it more responsibility and power. He was sort of an expansionist in a way that like modern warhawks are.
Yeah, so I guess you could say he was the first, the first, um, oh gosh, what's that term for, uh, uh you okay, Fowler?
Yeah,
Goddamn.
I'm good.
Okay, Jesus Christ. He was the first, I guess one of the first like neocons you could make the argument for, although it's very obviously it's shifted since then. Um,
Well, Hamilton is he's one of the few big government players in the early founders because the founders were obsessed with the idea of avoiding tyranny, and part of what they viewed as tyranny was the government. And Hamilton was not afraid of the government being that powerful, and a lot of he was sort of demonized within his time period for this, but a lot of great presidents who came after him were also Hamiltonian and wanted to centralize power and wanted to be kind of big government players. TR was famously a Hamiltonian. FDR was a Hamiltonian. So LBJ. So it's kind of interesting. But
yeah,
a lot of the founders at the time, like Jefferson being the most prominent, were terrified of America becoming an empire and were terrified of America basically centralizing power enough that the revolution would be for naught.
yeah. You have to take into account, I think, when you look at these things that, they were America was just coming out of our conflict with, the United Kingdom, and um what had been fought for was freedom and was, self-determination. And, I think, for many of the, original founders of the United States, there was the constant question of, okay, well, what is freedom? How can we have a country that's free when we do have, I think at one point it was, I think by the time the Revolutionary War ended, it was like of millions of enslaved people down in the South and certain parts, up near the North as well. And, um, like, so that was a constant question, a constant push and pull. I mean, Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette, he was a very outspoken opponent of slavery because of its, because of the what he believed is the hypocrisy, the idea that you're fighting for freedom against the British, but you have people on your own soil that don't have their freedom. But, putting all of that aside, um, I think, as I was doing a lot of my research into these figures, and it's interesting looking back on my education. My knowledge of many of these figures was very scant. I mean, I know we learned about Thomas Jefferson in school, we learned about George Washington, we learned about Hamilton, but we never really learned about them. We learned that they, they wrote really good words, and they were, involved in the Revolutionary War, but little is paid to, and I think this is something that doesn't even have to be politicized. I think it's something that everybody can agree on, but like it lends some credence to the idea that America has always had these polarizing views. When you learn about the views that Hamilton had, when you learn about the views that Jefferson has, and you learn about the different ideologies that were constantly at war with each other even before Washington completed his first um, his first term as president. I mean, um, one of the things I hear a lot from people today is the idea of, oh, we're all so polarized, and there is, I think there is some truth to that, but I think a lot of that's the media. I don't think a lot of that is individual people just have opposing views on different things. I think it's that we've created a media atmosphere where we can build our own echo chambers and stay in our own echo chambers and not actually have to interact with people who don't already agree with us on certain
People don't
things.
remember that, like, the golden period in which there were no political parties and there wasn't really like a disinformation propaganda network of newspapers, like that was basically just George Washington.
Yeah,
As soon as George Washington left power, I believe they're called the Democrat Republicans, or were they the Republican Democrats,
Southern
came to
Democrat,
power.
Southern
The
motherfucking Democrat Republic. Sorry, it's Hamilton. The Southern Democrat Republicans.
and the
Thanks, Lin
Federalist
Manuel
Party
Miranda.
came and the Federalist Party came into being, and they were highly partisan and very polarizing. And a lot of the early founders, including Jefferson, were very adept at using propaganda and slurring their political opponents and lying about them, and essentially um, doing all the dirty tricks we associate with modern media and modern politics.
Yeah. So it's just the tools that we use have evolved, and the the methods have changed, and so it's we don't want to, I think, romanticize the idea of this non-polarized past. I think a lot of people tend to do that, and ethnic nationalists do this a lot. They're like, oh, back when America was 90% white, we had no problems. And it's like, well, back when America was 90% white, they just made up a new white boogeyman to be afraid of. And then, it's all the same bullshit. It's just that the tools change and the the material changes. But, um, speaking of, speaking of, power and politics, uh, I was going to really try to bring up the Demagogue's Playbook and some of the things that I found really interesting about that piece of work that I was reading. Um,
Anything in particular, or
well, it was, it was the opening of the book talks about, the early, founders of the United States and exactly what you and I have just been talking about. And they talk about, the sort of the fundamental, I guess, paradox of freedom. You have, most of the people who founded this country, with the exception of a very small few, were, they came from wealth. I think Hamilton's one of the few people who really had to scrounge his way up from very, disparate circumstances. And I'm sure that affected his view on power. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Um, and I think, somebody like, Andrew Jackson is the same. Jackson's, there's a direct through line, I think, to the life that Andrew Jackson lived, to, the way he conducted politics.
Well, Jackson is interesting because he is in many ways the first demagogue. I guess you could say Jefferson was also demagogic, but he was the first person to really govern like a demagogue. And he's also the first like kind of working class like sort of president. So he was kind of the first man to crawl his way to power from the bottom, and he was also arguably the president besides Trump who was closest to ending our democracy.
Yeah, no, 100%. Um, like, but, going back to the demagogue's playbook and the paradox of freedom, I mean, that was a big point of contention amongst the creators of America. Many of them acknowledged the fact that, they were essentially, with the exception of a few, a gaggle of fairly well off, well educated intellectuals. Who were simultaneously arguing that the average man, who they did not view favorably, by the way. I mean, this idea that, they were repping the average man. I mean, many of them, I think, were doing it because it felt good. But for many of, the founders of this country, I mean, there was still very stark class differences, um, and racial differences, obviously. But I think, ultimately, class and race kind of become one and the same if you intertwine them long enough. Class differences at play, and they were very, very hesitant. And there was much debate about, okay, if you're going to create a new country, I mean, fundamentally, freedom is kind of an illusion. I think everybody, I think most people agree with that. I mean, we are only as free as we're allowed to be. I mean, there are limitations to our freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States. And, I think that once you fill in, the blank edges of the map and the world sort of closes in, Fowler, you would probably, disagree with me on this, but I think in a way, in certain areas we become more free, and in certain ways we become less free. I think it really just depends
The,
on how we organize our society, and what avenues open up for us and then what avenues close for us. Um, so
well,
freedom
we
is
have to
contextual.
remember that like the idea of us um, bending to the federal government, like most of the founders were state government people. So the idea of us having a large federal government, let alone a large federal government that like through the NSA and FBI spy on you and that like forces us to pay all these taxes, like they would have been um,
Appalled,
a lot
probably.
of them appalled by it. Yeah, and I mean the first attempt, I forget what it's called, but like the U.S. government was the second attempt to basically
Yeah,
form a
articles
country.
of
We tried,
articles of confederation.
yeah, which failed because they were too limited. So the founders, like America, was a more moderate backup plan to what a lot of the founders actually believed philosophically and ideologically should be the true way that the country should be governed.
It was a loose federation of allied states, uh, each with their own, um, each with their own sort of governing authority. I mean, I think one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation, if I'm not too well versed on the nitty gritty of the Articles, in large part because they're just like, I mean, they were the first attempt and it failed, so aggressively study, we don't as aggressively study the Articles of Confederation as much as we do the U.S. Constitution, understandably. But if I remember correctly, I mean, the Articles of Confederation didn't even lay out how states were supposed to, how states were supposed to resolve like trading issues. So if you had two states that were in conflict with one another because of a trading dispute, there was no body that could step in and properly, um, sort of properly resolve that dispute. And then the only way back then you could resolve it is through open conflict. And fucking Jesus, you know, that's not really conducive to a prosperous nation if you have all the different states fucking shooting muskets at each other. Um, so yeah, the America was a second go, was the round two, Electric Boogaloo. Um, and so I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind. But I think the question is, I mean, the fundamental question now, and I think, I'm, trying to shift my research into, environmentalism and stuff like that. I mean, you see inklings of this in environmental work where, there's some data to indicate that, like, when you start moving towards more conservative states, that, there is still that mistrust of the federal government. They prefer the state to be the ones that, determine, you know, uh, to kind of oversee, environmentalist policies, and a lot of it is trust. I mean, um, you have to want to trust the federal government, and historically, uh, more conservative, the sort of conservative proper ideology has been more of an emphasis on sort of the state and local communities, um, as opposed to the federal government. Um,
Yeah, although that's a little complicated because the historically, like, the reason people are for state government isn't because they have a real ideological like belief in it. It's usually because they lose control of the federal government, right? Like the Dixiecrats were not states' rights people because they were actually states' rights people. A lot of them were New Deal Democrats who were fine with um, the government expanding as long as the government expanded in the way they wanted to.
True.
And it's the
Yeah. No,
same
it's
thing
definitely
with
the
the
same. It's
early
definitely
segregationists, like John C. Calhoun, who's probably the most famous segregationist, or sorry, separatist. Like, he only really became a separatist and wanted the Confederacy to split apart after he lost control of the federal government to I think Clay and Webster.
Yeah, it's I definitely will agree with you. I think a perfect example is abortion. I think that's probably the most contemporary topic you can think of, is that, abortion being something that when left to the federal government would probably be enshrined in, the Constitution, but um a federal abortion ban is just not something that's ever going to gain steam, because overall abortion is, in the minds of the public consciousness, something that is settled. And so, we have to, with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, this issue becomes relegated to the state, because that's really the only, they can't rely on the federal government to push something like that because it's so overwhelmingly unpopular. Although I'm sure whoever gets in office, if we're looking at the polls, it's going to probably be a fucking Republican anyway, because Biden's fucking just tanking. They're going to probably try it. Uh, you
This
know what
might
I
be an
mean?
interesting segue to get into. We don't have to go deep into the Israel Palestine conflict, but maybe we could talk about how the polling for that has changed in America, because I think that's interesting and tied to Biden floundering.
Definitely. I'm gonna let you take control of this discussion though, because I'm not too familiar with the polling. I just know that it doesn't look good. That's all I know.
Well, so I think the parallel to this is actually Vietnam, where a lot of the old school Democrats of the Vietnam War were pro Vietnam. LBJ was pro Vietnam, and a lot of his contemporaries. And basically, part of why the Vietnam War fell apart is a lot of the new generation Democrats were against the war. And, the older members of the Democratic Party were like, party loyalty, get in line. And basically, the new Democrats told them to go fuck themselves. And I think we're seeing that now with Israel, where the default position of the party is pro Israel. And you see that in like Fetterman and Bernie and Warren and Biden all being pro-Israel. But you're seeing a lot of the younger ones like AOC or Rashida Tlaib who are basically anti-Israel, and it does seem to be a generational gap.
Yeah, it is a heavy generational gap. I think Bernie has, Bernie has straddled the line a little bit. He called for a ceasefire earlier than most of the other sort of old school Democrats, and he's not been as vocal about it as I think other people have. I mean, the issue is pretty. I mean, the issue boils down to technology, and I think this is where this is one of those things where it really does become a generational divide. Joe Biden is not looking at fucking looking on social media at this shit, and neither is any of the old fucks, the old Democratic fucks that are pushing for billions of dollars of spending towards Israel. I mean, they're not tuned into this shit. Meanwhile, everybody else under the age of 35 is, and I it's just very difficult. I think in spaces where there is in a space, really any space that there is broad access to social media, um, which is most of the world now, with the exception of a couple of places. I mean, China being one, and then like North Korea, obviously. But most places now there is the internet and social media is such a big part of you know um our lives that it's and of course places that are impoverished and poor are also not going to have access. But Israel is a fairly developed, I would argue, Western country, and it's just very difficult, I think, to commit acts of war and acts of terror, and to engage in um, overextensions of power in the age of the smartphone. Um, and
And
I
we saw
think,
the same thing happen in Vietnam,
yeah,
where the
exactly.
television was the first time that average people who weren't fighting in the war understood the real cost of war. And we're seeing on a regular basis, like, people being brutally murdered,
and it's
basically,
and it's
on
fascinating
television.
to me. What's really fascinating to me, and maybe this is just again the dissonance between the older generation of Democrats, is that I think Putin learned his lesson too with what he tried to do to Ukraine. And the result of the Russia Ukraine war has been Russia's Russia's economy has been devastated. Putin has fallen essentially out of favor of pretty much everybody. I think beforehand, Putin could skirt by getting along with people, but now nobody wants to engage with him. Um, and he's fallen out of favor and lost a lot. Even if the gain is small, he's sacrificed a tremendous amount, and that's in large part because we saw the Russia Ukraine war play out on TikTok and on CNN and NBC, and we're seeing the same, I think, with Israel Palestine. Just the propaganda and the flowery language is amped up because it's just very hard to mask what's happening. Um, it's just very, very hard to mask what's happening. And I think too, on top of that, with the Israel Ukraine war, like Hamas is not. We're very far removed from September 11th. The sort of like you know oh my God, I don't want to use the word Islamophobia because it's not Islamophobia. It's something. It's in the same vein. It's different, I think, though. It's sort of a. It's like a reflexive. Like for better or for worse, sort of a reflexive fear mongering about Hamas, about ISIS, when those two adversaries, if you're somebody that was born after 2001, I mean, they were always a sort of mythical adversary. You never actually, and you never actually had to. Nobody knew. You don't really know what that is. Like, I don't think most people know what Hamas is. I don't think most people really knew what ISIS is. It's sort of like a shadow villain. Putin is more tangible. Putin is a dictator. He's Russia is a at one point was a world superpower, and so you got to face to the terror with Hamas, with ISIS. I mean, I guarantee you none of the people protesting can tell you who the leader of Hamas actually is. Um, and that can work in your favor, and that can work against you depending on how you play your cards.
I just think it's very difficult to commit war crimes in this time period without it being revealed. You know,
Oh yeah,
like,
I agree with you completely. It's I absolutely agree with you. Um, that was not me trying to disagree with what you were saying. I completely agree that like fundamentally it's unless you have elite censorship and elite propaganda, and which it's very hard to do. And I think Israel is hindered by the fact that like Netanyahu, even within Israel, is incredibly unpopular right now.
well, Netanyahu fucked up in a lot of ways. Like, I don't know if we covered this on the podcast, but he knew in advance about the plan to attack Israel, and he basically didn't do anything to prevent it. So it's like, in context, that would be like Bush knowing about 9/11 and then not preparing New York in any meaningful way. It's just kind of an absurd thing to do.
Yeah.
And it makes him look weak, even if you're
Or
a war hawk.
it makes him look weak, but that also I think makes him look distrustful because okay, let's say I mean you can chalk it up I think to weakness and say you're just fucking stupid. Which very well might be the case, but I think then too it's like okay, well, if you knew about this and you didn't do anything and you've not demonstrated yourself as somebody who is cognitively fucking impaired, what other motivations would you have for allowing the attack to happen? And I think, that I think that can really put a blow to your it's a blow to your facade, and I think Netanyahu has stated deliberately, or at least members of his administration have stated that they want Hamas because the existence of Hamas invalidates Palestinians' claim to sovereignty on the world stage, because Hamas is a jihadist terrorist organization. Um,
Yeah.
so it begs the question, well, if Netanyahu knew about this, is it a matter of he doesn't give a fuck about the 700 people that were killed. He would gladly sacrifice 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 Israeli civilians if it meant that he was able to sort of keep this game going with Hamas so that he can stay in power.
Netanyahu has handled himself like a complete lunatic, and he makes it harder for people who are pro-Israel, like Fetterman or Biden, to support him because he, by being erratic, by saying a lot of the crazy things that he's done, by doing war crimes, he makes it very hard for American politicians to back him without it making them look bad. And I do think that he is unreliable enough as an actor that, like, unlike Zelensky, he's just going to become a political liability for people who are pro-Israel, but know that some of their voters are going to be turned off by Netanyahu's actions.
Oh yeah, and we also haven't even talked about, and maybe we'll have to. I mean, we got time, so we can. I mean, we've not even talked about the domestic crackdown too that's happening. The shit going on with Harvard, MIT, and Penn. The censorship. Mehdi Hassan getting fired from NBC for being pro-Palestine.
What time are we at? Do we have time for that, or is this too?
We're at 33. We got time. We got like 10 minutes.
Okay.
Um,
I don't know as much about Mehdi Hassan in the schools, so you might need to cover that more.
well, honestly, we could probably do a separate podcast on it because to be honest with you, I just all of it has happened so quickly. All of this stuff happened within the span of a week, but I mean, from what I've seen of it, um, 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 it's we would have to go in depth in a lot of this because the Harvard shit and the Mehdi Hassan shit I think deserves a very thorough analysis, but um, there definitely is a domestic crackdown. I mean, I think we can talk about that. I mean, the feud even on sort of the right. I mean, looking at the feud between Candace Owens and Megyn Kelly. Again, a pretty stark generational divide, as Megyn Kelly is older than Candace Owens. Earlier in the conflict back in October, a group of there were calls from the right to essentially like expel students from various universities for protesting, for protesting the war. And Candace Owens was like, well, it's their right to say stupid shit on campus. They don't need to be expelled for exercising their First Amendment. And Megyn Kelly's response, and the response of many other people on the right, was to say, fuck freedom of speech. Like, if you um if you like disagree with the idea that what Israel is doing is bad, you deserve to be punished. And so I think in a weird way, this whole thing looks really bad for both the right and the left. Like, I don't think I've seen an issue where on both sides of the political spectrum there has been sort of a split. I mean, like a very clear like ideological alliance in the worst way. I mean, like both the right and the left have essentially called for censorship. And I think like like I think the American public is already very, very distrustful of both institutions, both the GOP and the Democratic Party. And I think just all in all, like, usually when you have an issue like this, it helps one party and hurts the other. I think this is hurting both political parties in a way. Um, just with the way it's been handled and with the lack of sort of principled figures that have stood up, with the exception, of course, of the squad and of AOC and Rashida Tlaib. Um,
Well, it's hard because geopolitics is really important for maintaining the country, but I think it's often a harder sell for the public. Like I think an example of this is World War II, where FDR had a lot of problems where like maintaining Europe was really important from a geopolitical context. Like having Europe fall to Hitler would be disastrous, but also it's hard to hold the position like your money and your children are going to die in the battlefield of Europe. And I think it's why FDR had to walk that line really carefully. And I think we're seeing that same thing here, where like Israel is to a lot of people a really important geopolitical ally. And we need them in the Middle East in order to maintain our control. But also, it's hard to tell taxpayers that tens of billions of dollars of their money is going to essentially like a conflict that doesn't affect them in a day-to-day sort of way.
yeah. Well, especially during a time of tremendous economic insecurity, where people are really, I think, feeling, there's a lot of issues that need to be resolved and a lot of, I think, post-COVID problems that just have not been fixed. Um, and even if the numbers look good, I mean, the numbers for the economy, I mean, the one thing that I think is really interesting is that the actual raw numbers of the economy are looking really good, but it's not reflecting in the voters. It's like, inflation has gone down, the interest rates are starting to stabilize, like um all of these things are starting to even out. But again, I think it's what I've said in the past where like, people are economically frustrated. I think people are frustrated with their jobs. I think people want to be paid more. I mean, every person I've talked to has said exactly the same thing about, the sort of, I guess, the internal state of their, of the internal state of things. And I just think it's, and I don't know. I think there's a lot of frustration from the American public that just hasn't really been resolved yet. And we're seeing kind of an imbalance um, between what the politicians think is happening and what is actually happening on the ground. And that can
Yeah,
be
that's
a
definitely
very dangerous miscalculation. And I think Biden is learning that lesson, or he's probably not learning anything at all because he's indicated that he's not learning anything. He's with the way he's behaving. He's indicating to me that he has no intention of actually, uh, learning the lessons of the past 3 years. I don't know, Fowler, if you saw this, but did you see the clip of him saying that like no Jew can be safe unless Israel is safe?
yeah, not
Yeah, just
good
like
stuff.
insane shit. Like what? um, I mean
Yeah,
the
Biden is has actually really has been really good on foreign policy. He pulled us out of Afghanistan. He protected Taiwan. He was really good on Ukraine. and he's just really shit the bed of Israel, which is kind of interesting because like Biden, a lot of Biden's experience, and this is why he became vice president, is foreign policy. It's foreign policy is supposed to be his wheelhouse, but he has taken a very conventional and wrong approach on Israel.
Well, he just keeps saying stupid shit. You know what I mean? And it's very. I mean, on top of that, on top of what you just said, he just keeps engaging in the issue. I think it's old person brain. It's unironically, it's. I think it's just him misreading the youth. Because it is very split, very generationally. But I think it's him. I think it's him misreading. Where the discourse has gone. Um, and I think I think I think he's just made a very bad miscalculation. Um,
What we should do at some point is talk about the threat to democracy and Biden's selfishness of not stepping down. I think that would be a really good topic.
oh
So we
yeah,
should write that down and do it. We
yeah.
don't have time to do it in 10 minutes, but I
No, we
think that
don't.
would be a good one.
We'll have to talk about that. Probably as the election draws closer and closer. I mean, it's that.
Because Ardot and I are both were initially big fans of Biden. We both really thought Biden was doing a better job than the polling indicated that he should be. But the last year has been disastrous for him for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's. I think there are a lot of. I mean, to make it short, there are a lot of I think factors swirling around. Um, I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is another discussion we probably should have talked about when it happened, but I don't know, Fowler, if you saw the. I think it's 112 uh, members of Congress have resigned over the past year. There's essentially
112
yeah, it's like 112 over the past like certain amount of
in
time.
state legislatures
No, no,
or
no,
in
federal,
the federal.
federal. There was an interview
Huh.
with a GOP congressman who resigned, and they asked him why he was resigning. And he basically said like it's non-functional. He was like the federal government is non. He was stating his resignation as like I came here thinking that the federal government would have a sense of cohesion and functionality, and he's basically said at this point it's a non-functioning entity. He was like there's too much going on, like there's just too much non like there's too, he basically said there's too much going on. He was like it's just a shit
I
show.
will have to do more. I'll have to do more reading on that. I did not see that
Yeah,
article.
it was like
112.
I think it was
112
112.
is a lot, though. Are you sure it's 112?
Let
Because
me
there's
double
only
check the number.
435. There's only
Oh shit,
435
hang on,
members
maybe
of
it was
Congress.
okay. Um. Oh, it was more than 3 dozen. I'm sorry.
Yeah, because for
I
435
don't know where
members
I
of
thought the. I don't
Congress.
know where I got the 112. Over 3 dozen. That's a pretty big amount, though.
Yeah, it's more than 36. That's a lot. It's like a that's like what like a 12th of Congress.
Yeah, and apparently it's a trend. Like apparently it's a trend of that. Um. It seems like it's a combination of non-functionality, and then also like just them aging out because so many of them are fucking over the age of like 70. So a lot of them can't functionally do their job anymore.
Yeah, not ideal.
Um, it seems like most of them are on the Republican side, which is contributing to the dysfunctionality of the Republican Party. And many of the ones that are leaving are Republicans who have said that the Republican Party is dysfunctional. Uh, um, so I mean, we're not in a good spot overall. I mean, the Biden shit I think is just another piece of shit in the shit sandwich, as I like to say. Because we're not in a good position. I mean, if you are someone who is a fan of the government, I am embarrassed for you because it seems like the government, and I think that's the overall sort of feeling of the American public. It's less so like, oh, I really like this idea. It's more so like, wow, the government seems to just not be um, functioning the way it needs to function, um, or just not functioning at all. To be honest with you.
The polarization has become bad enough that I think there is very little cooperation between the parties in a way that's very negative.
Yeah. Um, yeah. So that's our podcast. We're gonna end it on that note. It was a very it's a very happy note to end it on. Make sure you guys vote in your local elections. Make sure you guys register to vote and to do your patriotic duty as Americans. Um, said that very convincingly, but Fowler, you got anything else to close out with?
I am all good. Next episode we'll talk about Biden not stepping down and the implications of that.
Yeah, that can be our next episode. I'm holding you to that, Fowler. Remind me, I'm gonna forget. But um,
Okay.
thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see y'all in the next podcast.